This is the vodcast for 6.2, the railroads. This recording or this vodcast follows 5.2, the time period of settling the West and the farmers, and so it's a logical transition to the next step of how did everything get out west. Well, it was all because of the railroads. The railroads had a huge impact on settling the West, and they also had a huge impact on inflicting a lot of harm on the country and on the farmers. So there was a lot of good the railroads did, and there was a lot of bad that the railroads had done. And that's what we're going to talk about in this section. Your objectives for this lesson: identify the role of the railroads in unifying the country. Again, a lot of the good things that they had done. Positive and negative effects of the railroads on the nation's economy. There are positive effects like job creation, but there's also negative effects such as the Credit Mobilier scandal, which we'll talk about later. And then summarize the reasons for and outcomes of the demand for railroad reform. What exactly were they doing that would cause people to demand reform or change on the railroads? Just a few things that the railroad did positively. Local transportation, obvious. Westward transportation or westward expansion for businesses and people. And then in order for this to happen, the government had to make huge land grants. We talked about that in the last unit. These land grants are 10 square miles in a state for every mile of track laid by the railroad, or 20 square miles in a territory for every mile of track laid by a railroad. And this map here shows you all of the land that was given to railroad companies as a result of those land grants. Now there's a little bit of land grants down in the southeast part of the United States, but we want to focus mainly on this. This is a lot of land out here in the Midwest. Now, just as a reference point, here we have Native American land, and a lot of Native Americans who didn't live on reservation lived up here in the Dakotas, but also out here in Nebraska and out in Colorado and Wyoming. Reservation land here. Notice that the railroads were not going through Oklahoma yet, and that's why everything stops right there. A lot of cattle drives, however, go through Oklahoma from Texas up to these main points, so there was some conflict there. Just a little bit of general information about the growth of railroads. You can see from 1856 railroads reached the Mississippi River. By 1859 they're to the Missouri River. 1906 we have railroads crossing the entire United States. This is the famous Transcontinental Railroad, the very first railroad that was created. The Central Pacific starts in Sacramento, California. The Union Pacific starts in Omaha, and they work toward each other. The Union Pacific had more land to travel, but also if you know the geography of this land, especially between here and here, very, very flat land. Not a lot to worry about. You got to worry about your occasional Native American attacks because we were impeding upon their land. But really, until the Colorado Rockies, they didn't experience any issues. Sacramento, if you know anything about the geography of California, you start out in the mountains, and you're constantly digging through, tunneling through, dynamiting through mountains. They reach Promontory Point, Utah, which is in Utah, where they lay the golden spike. Here's a photo. This photo is of the finishing of this the very first transcontinental railroad. You can see here a couple of gentlemen shaking hands. You have to assume that one side's Central Pacific, the other's Union Pacific. Just a gentleman's handshake. Photo op. They finally completed it. They finally finished Lincoln's goal of connecting the United States by rail. Who built the railroads? We could not find enough workers in America to build the railroads. To be honest, white adult males thought the work was too hard for too little pay. So we go outside the country and we actively seek Chinese immigrants for the job. We advertise in China, come to America, be citizens, build our railroad, get a job. And for the Chinese at the time, that was fantastic. There was a huge potato famine in Ireland. Farms were going bad. So we also advertised in Europe for workers. There was a huge Irish immigration population boom in the east coast of the United States, and to be honest, there were not a lot of people who were willing to accept the Irish in the east coast. There comes a stereotype with the Irish that they're dirty, they're lousy, they're lazy, they're drunks, they steal from you. So they weren't really welcome in big cities. There were signs in stores in New York City, help wanted, but down below it says Irish need not apply. People weren't willing to accept the people from the Irish. That goes back to England, Ireland fighting for so many years. You got to remember, it's still 1800s. The United States is still extremely connected to Europe in their old English ways, and so that hatred for the Irish is still there. So the Irish go out west and they start building the railroad. Also, we find out-of-work Civil War veterans. After the war, what do? Well, there's not really any work for them. If they go back home, especially from the South, the farms aren't there, and with Reconstruction going on, life was pretty tough. So a lot of old Civil War veterans begin to work on the railroad as well. A lot of railroad disease or accidents happen around there, and that just makes sense. Anytime you're dealing with dynamite, you're going to have accidents. About 20,000 people killed in roughly a 35 year period. Typical Irish worker. The stereotype of the Irish worker came with them. This person is carrying tools of the trade, but these are not given to him by the railroad. He had to come with his own tools because the railroad was afraid that he would steal the railroad tools. And then a photo of Chinese workers working for the railroad. This kind of gives you an idea of the conditions the railroad workers were surrounded in at any point. This overhang could collapse the walls of the tunnel here. The dirt could just collapse on them, and you could lose anywhere from 15 to 20 workers in an instant. Time zones become a big item when railroads become popular. A professor by the name of C.F. Dowd comes up with the idea of dividing the world into 24 different time zones, and we still use those today. The map here, it's a really good map. You can see the time zones of the United States. We are in Missouri, and so we live in the Central Standard Time Zone. We talked about in class briefly where the time zones break, and I think today when you cross through, if you're traveling on Interstate 70, when you cross in between India and Illinois, you experience the time zones. So the time zones have changed slightly. Now, the time zones don't follow a straight up and down pattern like you kind of see here, especially the Eastern time zone. I don't know if it's exactly right, but I think it comes clear over here to the Panhandle, and that's all political. One more thing about this map, you see the red lines, these indicate rail lines. If you look at the key, this railroad line here, it says right-of-way 100 yards wide. So everywhere you see one of these rail lines, this is in reference to the land grants given to the railroads by the U.S. government. They had to the north and the south, in this case, in this railroad here, in this rail line here, to the north and the south, 100 yards to either side. So 100 yards, north or south, or if the railroad company wanted to go 30-70 or 40-60, they could do whatever they wanted to, again, because the government wasn't regulating. The government simply said, you have a 100-yard leeway, a free zone, essentially. So they could dictate however they wanted to. So that's just really interesting about that map. Again, it shows you all the transcontinental railroads. Again, there were 5 transcontinental railroads. On the last map, notice we said no rail went through Oklahoma because it was Indian territory. Well, I'll just give the American government a little bit of time, and they will go back on their word. Here you see a rail line going through Indian territory. Again, just information about the time zones. Congress doesn't adopt it until 1918, and then after 1918, that does change, like I showed there. With the movement of railroads, east coast to west coast, we see other industries being impacted. Iron industry, because the rail was made out of iron at the time. Coal, because the trains ran on coal and they hauled coal back to the factories back east. Steel becomes a huge process. When we talk in the next unit, we'll talk about the growth of steel. Iron is brittle, it's corrosive, it's easily corroded by elements. Steel takes iron and basically puts it into a pure form, and then eventually the rails are made of steel. Lumber, same thing, cut down lumber in the forests in the west, in the mountains, and then haul that off to the east coast for the building of homes. Glass becomes a major commodity for the building of the homes in the towns out west. Glass in the east is shipped out west. And then obviously with the growth of railroads, we see a huge population boom. It's a really good map if you could see it in front of you on paper. It looks basically gray right now, but what you see, and this is a good section right here. What you see here, all these little lines, what look like rivers, these are railroads. And there were so many railroads by 1900 that we could not possibly use them all. And as a result, a lot of railroads go bankrupt and are consolidated under other railroads like the Union Pacific. The more profitable, the more industrious, the bigger railroads, they swallow up the little railroads. They buy up the little ones and consolidate. So they really have a monopoly on the railroad industry. Talking about the growth of population, let's look at this chart real quick. Population of New York City, a little bit over 1 million. Just 60 years later, they're over 4 million. This is because of immigration, not because of the railroads. But when you get into a town like Cleveland and LA, we see a huge increase in Chinese immigration. In 1860, LA is 4,400 people. 50 years later, they're at 319,000. Now, 319,000 is not a lot of people, but when you start at 4,000, it is. Look at the percentage of increase. Over 7,000% increase in population. And the majority of these was Chinese because they're building the railroads. Again, just some information about positives that the railroads brought to the economy. They bring towns together. They promote trade. A nationwide network of suppliers and buyers, so it doesn't matter where you live. If you wanted something from California, you order it and it gets put on the train and it is brought back to you, to the East Coast. Chicago and Minneapolis become a hub for grain storage, and when we talk about the case of Munn versus Illinois, it's in Chicago, Illinois, the storage of grain. Other cities like Abilene, Kansas, Flagstaff, Arizona, Denver, Colorado, and Seattle, Washington. Abilene, Flagstaff, and Denver all grow up because of railroads and because of the cattle drives. These are main center loading points for cattle drives. George Pullman makes his way onto the scene as people are traveling across the country on these new rail lines, on the transcontinental railroads. He realizes that the distance that they are covering, they need some kind of comfort. So he builds what's called sleeper cars. So you have padded seats now for comfort, and then right behind your padded seat you can see a bed you just crawl into, pull the curtain, and you can sleep for a little while. So traveling in comfort. Luxury is nice now to travel across the country. If you were lucky enough to get a job with Pullman, you were unlucky because you had to live in his town. Some people may think it's pretty cool to have a town named after you, strictly for your workers. I think down in Florida, Orlando, Florida, is it Disney World or Disneyland? You have the choice of living in this little town that's made for the workers of Disney World or Universal Studios, but you don't have to. Now, if you worked for Pullman back in the 1800s, you had to live in his town. Pullman had very, very strict rules for his town. No loitering. That means no hanging out with your buddies outside your door. After work. After work, you go home, you eat dinner, you go to bed. No alcohol, no drinking. You shouldn't be drinking anyhow, but no alcohol in town, in Pullman town at all, because if you drink or if you stay up late, you're not going to be at your peak performance for the next day's work. And he wanted his workers to produce the best quality sleeping cars. Now we get into some scandals. During President Grant's presidency, we see a lot of scandals which cause a lot of people to lose focus on Reconstruction. Remember, we're still talking about the time during Reconstruction. One of those scandals is the Credit Mobilier scandal. The Union Pacific created a company to lay track. This company is strictly on paper. They called the company Credit Mobilier after some French finance corporation, some French banking company. That's where they got the name. It had nothing to do with the French company other than the name, I think. So they create this company on paper. This company supposedly is laying the track that is getting the extra land from the government, the 1 mile track, 10 square mile deal. They are charging the government 3 times more than what it actually cost, and because the government is not interested in checking paperwork, they just simply want track laid. they are paying these bills? Well, because the Credit Mobilier is not a real company, it's actually Union Pacific executives. The Union Pacific executives are pocketing all the profit. They're building the railroad and they're pocketing all the profits. This is one of the big scandals, because this money then is in return used to bribe congressmen to look the other way, meaning do not pass laws that would regulate the railroads. And it becomes a huge embarrassment for the Republican Party, who is supposedly in charge of reconstruction of the United States. They're the ones who are supposed to be rebuilding the country, and we find out that a few of the leaders of the Republican Party back in the 1870s are destroying the economy and cheating the government. This guy is Thomas Durant. He is a congressman, and he is not, by the time Credit Mobilier is exposed, he is no longer a member of the Credit Mobilier. He's a congressman, but he's no longer part of this whole thing. But he is called into question before a Senate committee about the extent of this scandal. Grangers versus the railroad. Another name for the Grangers are farmers. Farmers, when they get upset with what's going on, they form a group known as the Grange. The Grange eventually becomes the Populist Party. So there's your line. There's your the sequence of events. Farmers form the Grange becomes populist. They're tired of the corruption. They're tired of the lack of regulation by the government, and so they begin to demand regulation by the government. And you can see that the misuse of land grants. The railroad said they would promise to sell the land given to them by the federal government. They sell less than 10%. The rest of it's given to bonanza farmers or taken control of by the railroads and Credit Mobilier, scandals like that. We see different prices for different customers. You can have a customer living in Iowa shipping his grain to Chicago, and he would have to pay $10 a mile per ton. But you see someone who lives in Nebraska shipping the same grain, the same distance, to the same warehouse, and he has to pay $5 a ton. There was no regulation. It just so happened like maybe you know the company executives better, and so you're going to get a better price. Maybe you'll cut them a deal and give them more of your profits. So there's no set regulation. So the farmers were upset about that. There's one instance where we see prices for shorter hauls were higher than longer hauls. A man, I'm just going to draw on the screen here, let's say a farmer living in, Kansas, wants to ship his grain to Chicago, and he has to pay, let's just say $1,000 to get it there. I'm just making stuff up. Meanwhile, there's a farmer in South Dakota, and he wants to sell his grain in England, across the Atlantic Ocean. So he has to go to Chicago, go to the Great Lakes, cross the Atlantic Ocean, and into England. He has to pay $500. Why? Because the railroad said he can, because the railroad is going to get some of their profits, because there's no regulation of the pricing on shipping. The government was not in the business of regulating business, This is a really neat cartoon which we will look at in detail in class, but let's just take a second just to look at it, and I'll just give you the brief overview. We have the Union Pacific Railroad. The owner is Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt represents a monopoly that the Union Pacific had on the railroad industry. Remember I said they were buying up and consolidating all these smaller railroad companies? Over here we have people in Nebraska being held up by this gun, Nebraska territory. Here in the Wyoming territory we have merchants being held up. We have a miner, a mechanic, and just a merchant, a grocery store owner. Giving support to the railroad is the United States Army. These people are on their way back east. They've had enough of the Western life. They've had enough of the farm life. They have enough of being taken advantage of and no government regulation, and they are heading back east. The train has already ran over Lady Justice. Justice is usually a woman, usually blindfolded, and she carries the scales of which she measures each case. And she in Union Pacific is also destroying industry. Again, we'll look at this in class, but it's a really neat cartoon. indicating just how powerful the railroads have become and how they are treating everyone else, and there was no government to stop them. In fact, looks like the government is supporting them. How did the Grangers tackle the railroads? We see farmers, Grangers, getting elected to a lot of state and local levels, not at anything national yet. A few state senators, but most of it was state and local level. And so they began to pass legislation or laws that protect farmers. In 1871, we see a lot of Granger laws, or laws that favor farmers, such as maximum passenger rates. So now you can only set a certain rate at a maximum level. You can't go above that. Stopping discrimination between one farmer and another. This catches on and goes all over the country. Most of the Grangers were in the Midwest, but there were some in the Southeast and Florida and Alabama. Railroads try to fight back but lose in when they get to the state Supreme Court or the United States Supreme Court. And one instance is Munn versus Illinois. Munn is a railroad warehouse owner, and he is charging excessively high prices for the storage of grains. Why? Because he can. The government's not regulating. The government's not telling him that he cannot. The Illinois state government steps in and, supported by Grangers, says, okay, this is how much you can charge. You can't charge above this level. He sues because they're taking away his right to earn money. And the state of Illinois says, no, it's not yours until it's actually in your hand. So here's the law. Here's the limit. This is what you have to stick to. Munn takes the case to the United States Supreme Court, and the United States Supreme Court votes in favor of Illinois. It says, yes, that is not your property until it's in your hands. So you have to follow the Illinois state law that says maximum rates. The Munn versus Illinois case is followed up by the Interstate Commerce Act, and this is the first time the federal government steps in and regulates business. And here's the key. Interstate means businesses that cross state lines. The state of Missouri can regulate a railroad that operates within the state of Missouri. It cannot regulate railroads that go from Missouri, Kansas, and Illinois, or Iowa, Missouri, Arkansas. That's interstate. That becomes a federal government. So the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 puts that power into the hands of the federal government, and they begin to regulate those laws, those rates that the railroads run by. But it's really not enforced until 1906, when Teddy Roosevelt comes into office, and we'll get into more with Teddy Roosevelt when we talk in Chapter 10. This is a picture of J.P. Morgan. Again, we'll look at this cartoon in class, so I don't want to go into a lot of detail. J.P. Morgan, he's a financier. I don't know if you're familiar with the credit card company J.P. Morgan and Chase. Basically, it's known as Chase Visa. Well, his company is still around today. He's not, but J.P. Morgan started that company. And here we see a newspaper. Looks like the New York Stock Exchange has been cut up. And we have Congress that is made up now representing a bunch of paper dolls. And that's all I'm going to say about that. Again, just take a look at it. We'll look at it in class, and we'll interpret this in class, just exactly what is this cartoonist saying about the power of J.P. Morgan. As a result of the railroad's abuse of the economy and the lack of government regulation, we enter into a economic recession. The government's trying to regulate, but it's not doing a very good job. The only thing regulation does is that it exposes more corporate abuses, more mismanagement of big business, the overbuilding of the railroads that we talked about, and the lack of competition, creating monopolies like the Union Pacific. And because of all that, we see 4 million people unemployed, businesses failing, banks failing. Here again, we see rich people like J.P. Morgan, who's not necessarily interested in following the rules, consolidating railroads, building his empire even bigger. And by 1893, 7 railroad companies controlled 2/3 of the railroad lines in the United States, which means they can charge whatever they want to, because you're going to be forced to use one of those 7. The picture there indicates, or just kind of shows you the men who are out of work, really nothing to do, sit around, play checkers while you hope for a job or a job opportunity to come by. And that is the end of Chapter 6, Section 2, the Railroads vodcast. Fill out your notes, watch this often, complete the form. See you in class.